Everyone to the Data Platform Women in Tech Virtual User Group. We're really excited that you are all joining us today. Just to note that this is being recorded. We will be sharing that later. We also do have a code of conduct, so by being here, we ask that you follow our code of conduct as well. If you want other ways to connect to us, we have a website. If you're in the meeting right now, you found us through Meetup. If you're watching online, please make sure you join us so you can see other things later. We're on Twitter, we're on Blue Sky, we're also on LinkedIn. We don't have that up here, but you can find us there too. But there are multiple ways to connect with us and share all the information and ways that we can support women in the data platform community. So we have a couple other things coming up. Next Monday, we actually have a new event we're actually trying to do once a quarter. We know we're international, so we're going to do something that's geared more to an international time zone that's not US centric. So we hope that some of you will be able to join us for that. Moran Weber is going to talk about coding like a girl or code like a girl, breaking the gender stereotype. It should be really great. Hope you can join us Monday as well. We've got January and February lined up as well. So we're really excited about those as well. So make sure you join us, put these on the calendar. If you're on the meetups, if you're on the socials, you should be able to get the reminders that way as well. All right. So with that, we're excited today to have Erin Dempster talk about Introduction to Automated Deployments with GitHub. So with that, please make sure you've muted your microphones. If you haven't yet, you can put questions in the chat, or if you can't do that, hopefully Erin will have breaks and we can ask those questions and get to those later. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to mute myself and turn off my camera.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here today. I'm Erin Dempster. Again, this introduction to automating database deployment with GitHub.
Erin, I think you muted yourself.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me
Works
now?
better. Yes, I thought it was me.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so again, I'm Erin, and we're going to talk about database deployments with GitHub. I've got some information about myself here. I'm the enterprise architect for a company in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've been a SQL Server DBA for years, as well as an Azure admin and a DevOps admin. I have the privilege and honor of being a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And when I'm not at the computer, you can find me in the basement doing some woodworking, or find me on the golf course or traveling. And I'll pause just a minute to let people grab a screenshot of contact information should you want to reach out to me. I will be starting some blogging on LinkedIn here in the new year. So a good way to keep in touch with me. So today, we're going to look at a couple of things for automation. First, I'm going to spend some time on capturing schema changes. So we'll use Visual Studio database projects for that. And then the second half of this, roughly, we'll be automating reviews and deployments using GitHub Actions. So before we get into Visual Studio, let's take a look at kind of the DevOps tool landscape, see who's doing work here. So Microsoft, of course, is a big player. Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, Azure Data Studio are all have SQL Server database projects. Other vendors include Redgate's Flyway. There's also Liquibase and DBUp. These on the right use a migration or change script based approach to deployments, whereas Microsoft tools is a state-based comparison between the project and the target. For source control, we have Azure DevOps and GitHub are the players from Microsoft. We also have other cloud, other solutions like Bitbucket, GitLab, Subversion. We're going to use GitHub today because of their GitHub Actions and to orchestrate deployments. And just note about the tools I've installed on my computer today. I'm using Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition. The current version is 17.12. Something, I think it's 3 today. It's updated frequently, so that number is always changing. And just as a side note, for database development or SIS, analysis services, reporting services, Visual Studio Community Edition is freely available to everyone. Even if you're in a large company, read the end user license agreement, but it is freely available, so you don't have to be running professional or enterprise edition of Visual Studio. Additionally, I have a GitHub runner on my laptop to deploy changes, and on on my computer as well as a SQL package that I will use to actually do the deployment, create that comparison and apply changes. So let's take a look at Visual Studio and database projects and why we want to use them. And I gave, as a little background, I gave a presentation a few weeks ago with Drew Squires-Cabala from Microsoft. And this was one of the slides he gave in our presentation. But think about database projects kind of in the same light as a .NET project. You know, you have your code, which you manage in Visual Studio. You build something in executable or DLL, and then you deploy that to an app server. We're going to do something very similar with SQL database projects. Instead of the C# code, we'll have the project, which manages all of our scripts. We'll build that into a DAC pack, and then we'll deploy the DAC pack to our database. So as an example of this, we'll use the customer table. And a very simple change we're going to make is to add the region to this table. So we build the project, create the DAC pack, and then when we deploy the DAC pack with SQL package, it does that differencing and it detects, oh, I need to alter the table customer and add the region field. So it'll script that out and apply that to the database. So Visual Studio projects have been around since, I think, Visual Studio 2008, roughly. So it's been a while. So Microsoft is coming out with a new style of project called SDK style. And it has a lot of new features. So the original project, the biggest thing, two biggest things was that the project file listed every single file. So if you have 1,000 objects in your database, they're scripted out. Your SQL project file had 1,000 entries, and it got big, and it was easy to miss files if you didn't add them correctly. It kind of is a mess. The other thing is that it requires the .NET framework for building. So we were bound to Windows infrastructure for CI/CD. With SDK style, there's a project file in your list of scripts, and all of the .SQL files within the subfolders are included in the project by default. So don't have that 1,000 lines of messy XML in the project file. It ends up being like 20 lines, I think, and just assumes that any SQL files aren't included. And with the SDK style, it supports .NET 8 or greater, as well as .NET Framework, which allows us to take away the .NET 8 removes the Windows requirement, so we can build these projects on a Linux container if we want. And there's some other things that Microsoft's working on with the SDK style projects. Should you want to use, you will want to use them. They will become the default. Right now it's in preview in Visual Studio. It's available in 17.12. There is a conflict with the current version that Microsoft's working on. So if you want to look at this, it does require a standalone install of Visual Studio that will be separate, needs to be separate from anything else you're using in Visual Studio. So even though we have the new project type, I am going to demo database projects with the old style of projects. So let's take a look at that. So I'll go ahead and create a new project. And we've got a lot of options here. All platforms, and then you can, best way to find the SQL project is to come over here to the third drop down, find SQL, and you have your SQL Server database project. So I've created the project, and the next thing we'll do is, well, it's creating now. Give me my computer a second. And now what we want to do is import the schema. So one way is to right-click on the project, import database, choose our connection. I have a local instance that I'll connect to. And this will take a few seconds to create the project. And as we can see behind, it's creating folders and it's generating scripts and all this great stuff. So it's done. And now we have stored procedures and tables and all this great stuff. This is the first time in the project, so perhaps I want to, the reason I'm making this project because I've got a change that we're doing. And so I can come in here. Add a new column. So we have modified date. We're going to say, give us created date. I'll allow nulls to let this work. And whatever other changes else I have, I can make these changes here. I'll go to the build menu and build the solution just to make sure everything works. And of course, this succeeded because it's a brand new project. So now I can come to the Get Changes tab and commit these changes. I'll stage them and sync them. So now this is taking the files on my computer, adding them to the local Git repository, and it's pushing them to GitHub. So let's go take a look at GitHub. I'm going to get logged in on another screen. While I do that, are there any questions at this point?
I don't see anything in the chat. I don't know if anyone has anything or like to chime in. If you come up with something, throw it in the chat and we can get to those later. But I think we may be set for now.
All right. So I am logged into GitHub, and I have a baseline branch, and we can see that I checked in changes a minute ago. Cool. So now there's things that we can go ahead and do. I will give us a little tour of GitHub for those that haven't really spent time. The first thing I did was choose the branch. So my default branch is dev, but I made my changes in baseline so we can see that this initial check-in was a minute ago. If I go back to dev, we can see that VentureWorks. I also did an initial check-in for another demo, but I did that 3 months ago. So let's go back to the baseline. And I'm want to get an automation kicked off. So I am going to do a compare and pull request. And what I'm doing here is I want changes to go from the baseline branch to the dev branch. So I'll have add some notes to the description and create that pull request. If I had required some approvals, people would get notified. I don't, because I don't want this demo to hang up too long. So it's ready to go, and I can say merge pull request and confirm that merge. So I can go back to the code, and now my change in the dev branch is from 3 minutes ago instead of 3 months ago. So I'm going to leave GitHub for now, and I do want to talk about now that I have the code in GitHub, there's or in Visual Studio, there's some things we can do with it. So back to the slide deck. One of the things that I have found very interesting is the T-SQL code analysis. This is built into Visual Studio today. There are 14 rules that Microsoft provides to detect common issues, whether they're in the bucket of design, naming, or performance. If you have these enabled, they'll run during the build process, either locally or in an automated process, like GitHub Runner. So you can enable these. These are saved in the SQL project. If they're enabled as a warning or as an error, and as your developers are working, they'll get build warnings and errors. So I just went ahead and selected everything to see what would happen with VentureWorks. And I got 14 warnings. Some nullable columns are being used in a predicate. Something's using the add identity keyword. There's some things that were flagged here. I just have these warnings. So let's take a look at these We'll take the second one listed here for a nullable column. It does show that it's in the SQL order header, line 103. So if I double click on that error, by gosh, it'll take me to that script on line 103, and it'll give me a note saying what is going on in a squiggly line. So I can change this and add the is null function to it, or find some other way to satisfy this final result evaluation. So that, again, that's built in. Besides that, we can do some additional checks. For example, did a build and a grant statement was found in a stored procedure. So we can catch, if we customize code analysis, we can catch easy mistakes. It's the stored proc. I wrote the stored proc and forgot to add a go statement before I granted the permission. So as a developer, I'll go back and add that go. This warning clears up and I can check it in and have confidence that I'm not doing extra work within the stored procedure. I use this as an example because I did have problems early in my career where a lot of us were early in our database careers and we needed to grant permissions explicitly on certain stored procedures to users, and we found that the grants were happening every time the stored procs were executed. So I thought this was fitting to come back and add this to code analysis. I'm not going to go through the code that it takes to add this to Visual Studio, but the link here at the bottom will take you to that documentation. But we can see when the code analysis custom rule is added, it'll show up in the project properties under code analysis, and I can use them as needed. Like I said a moment ago, you can automate the checks as well. So here's some GitHub action code, a workflow that's building the project. And we can see here in the MS build command, we have a property to enable code analysis and to actually throw an error for custom validation rule SR 2001. So when the pipeline runs, which we'll get to in a minute, when the pipeline runs, then it'll come back with an error saying the grant statement was found and the pipeline fails because it is logged as an error. I'll hold up for a minute before I really get into GitHub Actions. Any questions on Visual Studio or on code analysis?
I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay.
So I don't know if anyone else has a question.
Well, we'll move along, and if something comes up, throw it in. So GitHub Actions. This is the deployment automation feature of GitHub. You can really define your deployment process. We'll see that with the scripting in a bit. But you don't have to tailor your deployment process to what GitHub offers. In theory, it's very capable, and you can use tasks built by GitHub or by trusted community members. If there isn't a task that works for you, bring out some PowerShell or Bash scripts to run your custom tasks, and you can really tune them to what you need them to do. Or if you have some TypeScript skills, knowledge, you can create custom tasks for GitHub Actions so that they're reusable for you, or allow them to be available in the GitHub Marketplace for others. There are ways to run workflows. A single check-in, code check-in can trigger multiple pipelines. So maybe I want to do a build validation and just to make sure the code builds. Maybe I have some automated tests that run in dev to give quick feedback to the developers. Those could be the same pipeline or different pipelines. As I bring code changes from dev to test to production branches in Git and GitHub, I can have different pipelines triggered for each branch. Or I can have the same pipeline triggered by different branches. So there you have a lot of flexibility. As an example, here's the branch workflow that my team uses at Treon. We have the main branch, which is what's in production. We have a hotfix. Whenever you need to hotfix code, everybody works off of or commits to dev, and then you have features, various features people are working on that are merged to dev. So for pipelines, we can have a project validation that runs when a pull request is created in the hotfix or on a feature branch or in UAT. It can be the same code, just triggered in different ways, and we'll see what a trigger looks like in a moment. Or for deploying to test, that pipeline is just triggered in one spot. I have a different pipeline for UAT, and finally, a pipeline for production. So this just, again, lays out that there are a lot of options available for deployments. If this is too much of a workflow, you can scale that back into whatever branching strategy works for you. But just keep in mind that the pipelines can be defined to work with the process you need or you have. We are going to be making changes in YAML, or our pipelines are defined in YAML. That's a name that goes around. You hear it everyone quite a bit with DevOps. YAML does stand for YAML ain't markup language. It comes from the Unix space for configuration, so you have to have that recursive name, right? Seems like everything coming from Linux does. It is a configuration layout, so unlike JSON or XML that you're passing across the wire as a transport format, YAML isn't meant for that. It is meant just as a configuration layout for files on your local computer to supply runtime information. And just as a side note, it is used by both GitHub Actions and Azure Pipelines. There's a lot. We're going to look at YAML in a bit. Here are a couple of links that I think are really good. First is the workflow syntax. It's hard for me to keep in my head how things should flow, so I need to go back to the documentation at GitHub quite often. And then if I'm looking for a task, I can go to the Actions Marketplace and do a search for those. So for database deployments, there are tasks that I think are common, at least on the SQL side. The biggest thing you're always going to be doing is checking out code to copy code from your repo to the GitHub runner to do the build and deployment. There's a setup MS build to get everything ready for the build. And then if you're deploying to an Azure managed instance or database, you can use the run SQL package. It is important to note that workflows do need periodic upkeep. Tasks will be updated, and so you need to version these. I've laid out to the latest versions for checkout MS or setup MS build here. You'll see in later slides that they're quite outdated. So I need to go back and update those. On the GitHub runner, it's going to use MS Build. You have to have the build tools installed as well as SQL package exe. And that's used to, you can call it via PowerShell to publish changes to SQL Server. So let's get into YAML. Just as a quick side, here's a comparison between DevOps and GitHub. GitHub Actions are a lot more verbose and can be triggered in a lot of ways. So there's a lot more flexibility, but that brings some complexity to GitHub Actions. So for triggering, I've got a couple of examples. At the top of the workflow, you can have an on. And I've got two triggers here. So when code goes to the test branch through a pull request, this will run. And also I can manually trigger the workflow from GitHub. And then another example, besides, instead of targeting the test branch, this one's targeting the dev branch. And when the pull request is closed, the pipeline will, or the workflow will run. So that workflow documentation link from previous slide, there's like, I don't know, 40 scenarios of ways to trigger workflows in GitHub. If you want to do it, you can do it. You just have to find the doc for it. So once we've triggered a workflow, there are jobs that are going to be kicked off. They run either sequentially or in parallel. And there's some settings that will be inherited from the workflow that I didn't set them in these examples, but you can define like where the workflow should run, and jobs for one reason or another can inherit those settings from the workflow and override them. So here's an example of two jobs, and let's blow this up a little bit. So I do have two jobs. One's to build the project, and the other is to deploy it to test. So if I wanted to continue this process, I would deploy to UAT and deploy to production as additional jobs. And what we have going on is we're doing building the project with MS Build, and then we upload the artifact to the pipeline, or sorry, to the workflow, and define where it's going to be stored and what we're storing. Jobs in workflows are independent of each other, so anything that's built in a build process, when that job finishes, all the resources are cleaned up. So we have to upload the artifact to the workflow, and then the next job download it and work on it. This is a pattern. It may or may not work for you. That's just to point out that there is that kind of that isolation between jobs is definitely there. So again, in the build, we have the upload artifact, and in the deploy to test, we're downloading it, and then we run SQL package to publish the database to localhost. So that code is great. It gets us that automation to the test environment, but I want to do that again to UAT and production. And I probably don't want to rewrite or have multiple copies of the code, because I'm bound to have cause some issues. I'm just flaky enough to do that. So there is code reusability using environments and variables. So let's take this example. I have a trigger here called workflow call. So I actually can't run the script behind by itself. I need to call it from another script, such as this test deployment. And what I'm going to do is pass a parameter called named environment, and I'm passing test to it. So in the job, when it sees the environment, I can set the environment to test using that variable. I also have an actual GitHub environment called test. And in there, I have an environment variable called SQL instance name. So in my steps, just in this write info as well as in the deploy, I'm calling the variable SQL instance name, and it's going to return the value back to those places, Road Warrior / SQL test for my test instance. So this script works great for tests, and if I have another environment for production, notice I have the same variable name. I just changed the value to my production SQL instance, and now the same script will run when I have that. When that script runs, it'll point to production. So let's go ahead and go back out to GitHub and take a look at the workflows in action. So I do have 2 jobs that ran 19 minutes ago. One was versioning test. I just have a pipeline that basically I wanted to go and look to see, does it do something? And all it's doing is going and building the project. Checking it out. And I was just making sure that the GitHub versions were working. So I'll come back to the actions, and this deployment failed. And I found that it was looking for AdventureWorks SQL Proj. It didn't find it in that spot. So the job did fail. I can go and see. I think my code got buried a level deep. So that was a mistake when I set it up. So I can come into the actions, do the deploy template. Make a quick change to this template file. Come back to the actions. And it kicked off the 2 again because it's looking for changes to the dev workspace. And we will, so it's an imperfect system. You do have to clean it up. I've been fiddling with things, and obviously I've fiddled too much. Shame on me. I should have had this cleaned up, so I apologize. This is the one thing that you'll see with GitHub, working with GitHub Actions, there is a lot of trial and error. But it is, once it's going, it's great. So let's go back to test deployment from yesterday. It is the same workflow. I just, again, didn't check in my code quite right. So the test deployment came in and built the project, and then it deployed the DAC pack out to my computer, to the SQL test instance, and there weren't any changes between the project and the database. If there had been, it would have shown here after updating databases all of the objects that changed. And then just it finishes up with some cleanup. So this is what the flow looks like. So with that, slide back to the PowerPoints, and we'll wrap this up. So we covered Visual Studio and GitHub. Visual Studio or Flywheel looker-based DBUp, they are needed to compare changes against the target. Potentially, you could just put scripts into a source control that you create for alters and creates, and you can script your own thing to handle deployments. But the tools are out there to make it a lot easier. So I highly recommend using one of these tools. GitHub Actions, again, is doing our orchestrating, and environment variables and parameters help ensure or enable code reuse. It increases complexity a little bit, but I do think it's worth it. So thank you all for attending today. If there are any questions, feel free to shoot them out, or we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat. I don't know if anyone online has any questions that they want to unmute and ask, because now it is a good time for that. I will say, Erin, I'm glad you talked about code analysis, because I've always had a love-hate relationship with database projects, but I really feel like that code analysis is like one of those hidden gems of this sort of thing, because being able to capture problems, like I was doing a test for a session and I ran through it and I found something that I would have never found otherwise.
Yep.
So,
and I showed Microsoft's what's built in from Microsoft, and I showed a custom project that I created with the SDK projects coming early next year to Visual Studio. You may want to check out the SQL Smells code analysis project. There's an MVP who's created that. It's called SQL Smells, and there's like 250 tests that are run.
I'll have to check that one out for the name, if nothing else. I mean, I knew about SQL Fluff as a linter, but we don't think about linters, like we think about those as code, but as we start thinking about database as code, this stuff is really, really cool stuff. But SQL Smells, I'm writing that down. Any other questions from anyone online? Well, if you think of them later, we now have Erin's information.
Yes, please feel free to reach out. And again, thank you all for attending today.
Yes, thank you for attending. And thank you, Erin, for presenting. This was great. I see some applause up here. So yes, it was very useful information. I know This is one of those big things that we don't talk about enough. So I'm glad to see you present on all of these things.
Yes, I very much agree, and that's why I've targeted DevOps for the last couple of years.
Yes, it's excellent. And so this has been recorded. We will be sharing the recording later. So please make sure you keep an eye out for that. You'll be able to find them with our other recordings on our YouTube